The document arrived on the first day of May, 1889. It was not delivered with ceremony. There was no knock at the door, no formal announcement, no courtesy extended to the young woman who answered it. Elder Holt's clerk simply held the folded paper out at arm's length as though proximity to Evelyn Vance might be contagious and waited for her to take it. She took it. She stood in the doorway of the house she had shared with Aunt Thomas for 3 years, the house his father had built, the house where she had learned to cure meat and red weather and love a man who smelled of pine sap and honest work, and she unbolted the document with steady hands. Her hands had always been steadier than people expected. The language inside was the language of men who had decided something long before they wrote it down. It spoke of assessments and allocations of community resources and productive family units of the regrettable but necessary process of dispossession. It used the word widow 4 times. It used the word burden twice. It used her name, Evelyn Vance née Marsh, exactly once in the opening line, as though after that single acknowledgement, she ceased to be a person and became simply a problem to be administered. She was given 7 days. The clerk was already walking back down the dirt path before she finished reading. He did not look back. There was nothing in his posture that suggested he felt anything at all about what he had just delivered. He was a man doing a task. The task was complete. Evelyn folded the paper carefully along its original creases and set it on the kitchen table. Then she stood very still for a long moment, looking at the room around her. The cast-iron skillet hanging on its hook. The stack of Thomas's books on the shelf he had built crooked and never gotten around to fixing. The 2 woolen blankets folded at the foot of the bed. The small jar of wildflowers she had picked 3 days ago, still holding their color, sitting on the windowsill in the pale morning light. She did not cry. She had done her crying in the weeks after Thomas died, in the dark hours before dawn, when grief is at its most honest and most brutal. She had done it quietly alone because Havenwood was not a town that rewarded public vulnerability, and she had understood even then that her survival would depend on giving these people as little of herself as possible. Now she walked to the window and looked out at the valley. The Cinder Creek ran silver through the meadow below, swollen with snowmelt from the high peaks, catching the early light and throwing it back in pieces. The mountains on the far ridge still held their white caps. Closer in, the elm trees along the creek bank were just beginning to show green, tentative and new, the kind of green that made you believe in things again, even when you knew better. She had exactly 7 days. She went to work. The council met in the timber-framed hall at the center of Havenwood, a building that managed to be both imposing and joyless, the architectural expression of everything Elder Holt believed a proper institution should be. It sat at the intersection of the town's 2 main roads, and its windows faced outward in all 4 directions, which the older residents understood to be deliberate. Holt liked to see what was coming. He was 58 years old, with the kind of face that had never been particularly warm and had grown colder with authority. He had come to the Cinder Creek Valley 20 years ago with capital, and conviction had built Havenwood from a seasonal logging camp into something approaching a permanent settlement, and he carried the weight of that achievement the way other men carried religion, as both comfort and justification. What he had built was right because he had built it. What he decided was correct because he was the one deciding. To his right sat Barnett the blacksmith, a man whose physical size had always served as a kind of argument. He was broad across the shoulders, thick through the hands, with forearms that looked carved from the same oak he sometimes burned in his forge. He was not a cruel man, exactly. Cruelty required a certain investment of feeling that Barnett generally couldn't be bothered with. He was a practical man who had sorted the world into useful and useless, and he sorted people the same way. To Holt's left, Deacon Pruitt arranged and rearranged his papers with the nervous precision of a man who experienced the world primarily as a series of transactions waiting to be completed. He was 50 years old and had the soft, slightly damp quality of someone who had spent his life indoors measuring things. His store occupied the largest building on the Eastern Road, and its ledgers were, as far as Pruitt was concerned, the most reliable record of human character ever assembled. If you paid on time and bought in volume, you were a good person. If you didn't, you weren't. Evelyn Vance, he had already calculated, fell into the latter category through no active fault of her own, which made the whole situation tidier. Evelyn stood before them without being invited to sit. There was no chair offered. She had not expected one. She was 19 years old and 5 feet 4 inches tall, and she stood in the center of that austere room the way a plumb line stands perfectly vertical, offering no unnecessary motion. She had worn her good dress, the dark blue wool one Thomas had bought her from Pruitt's store on their first anniversary, because she understood that appearances in situations like this were a form of argument, and she intended to make every argument available to her. Holt read the formal declaration aloud. It took 4 minutes. His voice was measured and unhurried, the voice of a man who had never in his life been interrupted. The essential content could have been conveyed in 30 seconds. Thomas Vance is dead. His land belongs to the community now. His widow has no standing here. She has 7 days. Everything else was language designed to make an injustice sound like a procedure. When Holt finished, he set the document on the table and folded his hands and looked at her with the expression he reserved for situations that required the appearance of regret without any of its substance. "You understand the necessity," he said. It was not a question. Evelyn looked at him for a moment before she answered. She was looking at his hands specifically. The way they rested on the table, the complete stillness of them. "I understand what it says," she replied. Something moved briefly across Holt's face. Not irritation exactly. More like the minor adjustment a man makes when a machine behaves differently than expected. "This decision was not made lightly," he said. "The resources of this community are finite. A woman alone without family to assume her support. Thomas's land," Evelyn said, "produced more board feet of timber last year than any other claim in the valley." The room was very quiet. "It is Thomas's land no longer," Holt said, and his voice had moved from measured to final in the space of a single sentence. "The deed reverts to community holding. This is established practice." "Established by whom?" "By this council." He said it the way a man says something that should have ended the conversation before it started. "You have 7 days, Mrs. Vance. I would encourage you to use them wisely." Barnett said nothing throughout. He sat with his arms crossed and his gaze somewhere slightly above Evelyn's head, the posture of a man who has already decided the outcome and sees no reason to participate in the theater of arriving at it. Pruitt watched his own fingers as they worked the silver chain of his watch. Back and forth, a small nervous pendulum. Evelyn looked at each of them in turn. She took her time. She wanted to see them clearly, all three, to hold their faces in her memory, with the same precise attention she gave to the canyon walls, in the creek banks, in the color of the water, in different seasons. She had learned from her grandmother that the most important things were the ones people didn't know they were showing you. Holt showed her certainty, not the earned certainty of a man who has been tested and survived, but the institutional certainty of a man who has never genuinely had to question himself. It was a certainty built on the agreement of other people, and therefore she understood fragile in ways he could not perceive. Barnett showed her indifference, not malice, just the particular emptiness of a man for whom other people's difficulty registered only as inconvenience or irrelevance. There was something almost peaceful about his detachment. He had arranged the world to require as little of him as possible. Pruitt showed her calculation. His eyes, when they did move to her face, held a brief involuntary flash of something that might have been assessment not of her grief or her situation, but of what she represented in a ledger. A line item. A liability column entry being transferred. She filed all of it away. "Thank you," she said, which was not what any of them expected, and walked out. The news traveled through Havenwood the way news always traveled in small places, instantly and with embellishments. By afternoon, the general consensus had been reached and distributed. It was unfortunate, of course, but what could be done? A young woman alone. No family to speak for her. Thomas had been a good man. God rest him, but the land needed to be productive, and the council had to make hard decisions sometimes. That was what councils were for. Several women came to see her that afternoon in pairs, and individually with the careful, slightly averted expressions of people visiting a sickbed. They brought food she didn't need and sympathy she couldn't use, and the implicit message delivered through every careful word and every careful silence that they were sorry for her situation and glad it wasn't theirs. She thanked them. She was generous and specific with her gratitude because she understood that the women of Havenwood were not her enemies. They were people operating within a system that had given them very little room to be otherwise, and blaming them for that would be both unjust and a waste of the energy she needed for other things. But she did not weep for them. And she did not ask for their help. One of the women who came that afternoon arrived alone, and she did not bring food. She was older than the others, with the deliberate, considered movements of someone who has made a specific decision about what she is about to do and is committed to it. She stayed only a few minutes. But before she left, she leaned close and spoke in a voice just above a whisper. She said that Elder Holt had ridden out to Thomas's timber claim in the second week of October, 3 weeks before the widowmaker fell. She did not elaborate on what had been discussed. She did not explain why she was telling Evelyn this. She straightened and looked at her for a moment with an expression that contained both apology and the clear acknowledgement that apology was not sufficient, and then she left. Evelyn stood in the doorway and watched her go. She had no proof of anything. She would never have proof. The woman's words were not evidence. They were not even strictly speaking an accusation. They were simply information, the kind of information that once received reorganizes everything that came before it into a new and colder configuration. She thought about Holt's hands on the table, the complete stillness of them, the way a man's hands are still when he is not anxious about an outcome because he has already ensured it. She filed the information away in the part of her mind where the important things lived, and she went back to work. The only other visitor who mattered came after dark. Greta arrived just after the last light faded from the western ridge, moving through the dusk with the deliberate care of a woman who had learned to conserve her energy for what required it. She was 70 years old and had been old, truly old, the kind of old that carries real weight for at least a decade, but there was something in her eyes that had never aged, a quality of attention so concentrated it could feel like pressure when it was turned on you. She was Evelyn's grandmother, her mother's mother, the last piece of family left in the Cinder Creek Valley. She did not speak when she came in. She looked around the room at the packed boxes, the stripped shelves, the folded blankets, the organized pile of Thomas's tools, and she sat down at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on the surface and was quiet for a moment, in the particular way she was quiet when she was deciding something. Then she reached into her coat and set a leather pouch on the table between them. "Open it," she said. Inside were silver coins, $47, every piece of it worn smooth with age and handling. Evelyn looked at it and then looked at her grandmother and felt for the first time since the morning something shift in her chest, not grief but something adjacent to it, something that recognized love in its most practical form. "Greta, it is not a gift," her grandmother said. "It is capital. There is a difference." She straightened in her chair. "Now, sit down and listen to me because I am going to tell you something I should have told you years ago." Evelyn sat. "You know the falls?" Greta said. "Vale falls up on Cinder Creek. You know the stories. The dangerous ones. Children were kept away. Children were kept away because children do not understand the difference between danger and power." Greta's voice was dry and precise, the voice of a woman who had spent a lifetime making distinctions. "I went to those falls when I was 23 years old, alone, with a surveying rope and a spirit level, and 3 days of food because I had heard the stories that came before the stories everyone tells now. Older stories, stories from the people who were in this valley before any of us." She paused. Then she reached into her coat again. What she placed on the table this time was a piece of leather bin, almost translucent with age, the surface covered in careful markings in faded brown ink. Lines and measurements, angles and notations, numbers written in the small, precise hand of someone who trusted numbers more than words. Evelyn leaned forward. "That is the alcove behind the falls," Greta said, tapping the leather with one finger. "I surveyed it myself. The space measures 40 feet along the back wall and 22 feet deep at center. The ceiling is nearly 50 feet at its highest point. The back wall is solid granite, no fissures of consequence below the upper third. The floor slopes 1.5 degrees toward the front, which means water management is achievable with the right drainage work." She moved her finger to a series of notations along one edge. "The critical measurement is here. The alcove sits 31 feet above the highest watermark I could find on the canyon walls. Not the ordinary floodline, the highest mark, the one that comes from whatever happened in this valley long before any living person's memory." She looked up at Evelyn. "Nothing built in that alcove would flood. Not in 100 years of ordinary weather, possibly not in 100 years of extraordinary weather if it's built correctly." The room was very quiet. Outside, the creek murmured in the darkness. "You surveyed this 40 years ago," Evelyn said slowly. 43 years ago. "And you kept the plans." I kept the plans. Evelyn looked at her grandmother across the table. Why? Greta was quiet for a moment. Because I knew this valley, she said finally. I knew what it was capable of. And I knew that the people who were building on its floor, who were building their whole lives on its floor, were not asking the right questions. She touched the leather document again almost gently. I hoped I would never need this, but I was not foolish enough to throw it away. She slid the leather across the table toward Evelyn. The alcove can be made habitable. Dry, warm, secure. It will require significant work in a specific sequence of steps drainage, first, then foundation, then structure. I will tell you everything I know. The principles I learned, the materials that will last in that environment, the mistakes that will kill you if you make them. She folded her hands. You are the only person I have met in 40 years who has the patience and the intelligence to do it correctly. Evelyn looked at the plans, at the numbers, at the careful, faded handwriting of a 23-year-old woman who had gone alone to a waterfall with a surveying rope because she needed to know the truth of a thing. They'll think I've lost my mind, she said. They already do, Greta said. That is not your problem. Your problem is the drainage channels. We'll start there. They talked until well past midnight. Greta spoke and Evelyn listened with the focused attention she had always given to things that mattered, asking precise questions and remembering the answers with the accuracy that had always made her teachers back in the years when she'd had teachers slightly uneasy. By the time Greta rose to leave, Evelyn had committed the essential sequence to memory drainage, first then foundation, then structure. Water management above everything. Do not block the water. Guide it. At the door, Greta turned back. She looked at her granddaughter for a long moment, at the straight spine and the steady eyes and the careful hands that had stopped trembling hours ago. The water gives and the water takes, she said. It was something from the older stories, the ones that came before. But it always provides a sanctuary for those who know how to listen. Then she walked back out into the dark. On the third day of May, Evelyn Vance went to see Barnett. The forge was on the northern edge of town, set apart from the other buildings by practical necessity. The heat and noise and occasional sparks made close neighbors inadvisable. She could smell it before she could see it, coal smoke and hot iron, and the particular sharp scent of metal being worked. Barnett was at the anvil when she walked in, shaping what looked like a gate hinge with the efficient, slightly contemptuous precision of a man who was very good at his work and knew it. He looked up when he heard her step, registered who it was, and went back to his work without changing expression. She waited until he paused between strikes. I need 20 iron pitons, she said, 3-inch point, and a good felling axe. He set down his hammer. He turned and looked at her with the measuring look of a man taking inventory of a situation. Building something, he said. I am. Where? That's my business. Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, but its practical equivalent, the acknowledgement of a point scored. You're heading up to the falls, he said. It was not a question. News traveled fast in Havenwood, and the story of her 7 days had been circulating since yesterday morning. The pitons and the axe, she said. He quoted her a price $7 for the set, and she counted the coins out from the leather pouch without comment, setting them on the edge of the anvil with a steadiness that she suspected he noticed. He wrapped the pitons in oilcloth and set the axe beside them. Fine tempered steel hickory handle, the head balanced with the weight slightly forwarded the way she preferred. She picked everything up. She turned to go. The wolves will have you before the first snow, he said to her back. His voice was not unkind. It was simply factual, the observation of a man filing a prediction. She didn't turn around. The wolves haven't bothered me yet, she said, and walked out into the morning. Pruitt's Mercantile was in the center of town, and it smelled the way all mercantiles smell, of cured tobacco and coffee beans and the dusty, complicated abundance of things people need and things they think they need. The bell above the door announced her arrival, and Pruitt came from the back room with the expression of professional warmth that he applied to all customers and removed the moment they left. When he saw who it was, the warmth adjusted slightly. Not disappeared. Pruitt was too careful for that, but recalibrated. She was still a customer. She still had money. The moral dimensions of her situation were a separate accounting. She laid her list on the counter. 50 pounds of flour, 20 pounds of salt pork, 10 pounds of beans, a keg of nails, 200 feet of good hemp rope. She had worked the quantities, carefully calculating against the timeline and her capacity to forage once she was established. Pruitt went through the store gathering everything with the brisk efficiency of a man who knew where every item lived. He weighed and wrapped and stacked with practiced speed. When everything was assembled, he wrote up the bill and turned it toward her, $17.50. She looked at the figure, then she looked at the items. She had priced everything herself based on the posted rates she had read on Pruitt's own notice board by the door. The actual cost of what he had assembled was $14.30, $3.20 over. She looked up at him. His expression did not change. He held her gaze with the absolute comfort of a man accustomed to being the final authority on what things cost. She looked back down at the bill. She counted out $17.50 and set the coins on the counter. She picked up her purchases, distributed them between two burlap sacks, and slung both over her shoulders. She was already at the door when Pruitt spoke. "You should take that money and buy a coach ticket to the city," he said. He sounded almost sincere. "This is hard country for a woman alone. There's no future in these mountains." She paused with her hand on the door. She did not turn around. "Thank you for your concern, Deacon," she said, and she walked out. She noted the overcharge the way she noted everything. The way the water moved in the creek when rain was coming, the way the light changed on the canyon walls in different seasons, the way Elder Holt's hands had been utterly still on the table while he read a document that would destroy her life. She filed it in the part of her mind that was already calculating the months ahead, the work ahead, the long patience of building something that would last. She did not know yet exactly how that filed information would matter. She only knew that it would. Her final encounter with Elder Holt came on the 5th morning. She was making her last trip from the house, or rather from what had been the house, hauling a handcart piled with the organized accumulation of her preparations. The pitons and the axe, the food supplies and the rope, Thomas's tools carefully wrapped, the 2 woolen blankets, a small heavy box of books, Greta's plans in their protective oilcloth wrapping tucked inside her coat against her chest. The morning was cool and gray, with a thin layer of cloud diffusing the light into something flat and directionless, the kind of morning that made distances hard to judge. Holt was standing at the northern edge of town, as though he had arranged himself there specifically, which Evelyn suspected he had. He was in his good coat, his hat straight, his posture carrying the particular quality of a man who understood theatrical effect. Behind him at a careful distance, 3 or 4 townspeople had found reasons to be in the vicinity. They were watching with the careful inattention of people who wanted to see something while maintaining plausible distance from it. "Mrs. Vance," his voice was measured and civic, carrying just enough of projection for the benefit of the small audience, "I had hoped you would have the sense to leave the valley entirely. Start fresh somewhere more suitable." She stopped the cart. She looked at him. "Your intention," he continued, "is to settle somewhere in the immediate vicinity on township land." "I intend to build a shelter," she said, where she told him. The silence that followed had a specific quality, the silence of a statement so far outside expected parameters that the listener requires a moment of genuine processing. Then something crossed Holt's face that she had not seen there before, not contempt which she had expected, something more interesting. A kind of involuntary recognition, quickly suppressed, of something he didn't have the framework to understand. "Behind the waterfall." He said it as though testing whether the words made any more sense aloud than they had in his head. "That is," he stopped, started again. "The first spring freshet will scour that alcove clean. You'll be swept away with the river stones." "The alcove sits 31 feet above the highest water mark on the canyon walls," she said. "Not the flood line you know about, the highest mark." She paused. "Have you ever looked at those marks, Elder, on the canyon walls, the ones the old floods left?" He stared at her. "I've looked at them," she said. Carefully, something moved in the vicinity of his certainty, a hairline fracture there, and gone in an instant, too fast to be sure she'd seen it. But she had seen it, she was certain. "You are choosing your own destruction," he said, and his composure had reassembled itself around the familiar architecture of authority. "This is pride. Dangerous, sinful pride to disregard the counsel of those with greater experience and knowledge of what she asked, not aggressively, genuinely. What is it specifically that the council knows about Vale Falls and the hydrology of this canyon that I should be deferring to? The question hung in the air between them. He did not answer it. He could not answer it because the honest answer that the council knew nothing specific at all, that the falls had simply been designated as dangerous through accumulated habit and convention, was not an answer that fit his posture or his coat or the audience standing carefully nearby. She looked at him for one long moment. She thought about Thomas, who had stood in front of this man in the second week of October and refused to sell. She thought about the widowmaker that fell 3 weeks later. She thought about hands that stayed perfectly still because they had no reason to be anxious about outcomes they had already arranged. She had no proof. She would never have proof. But she understood, in the way she understood water and stone and the weight of things, what the absence of proof did and did not mean. "We will not be responsible," Holt said finally, "for retrieving your body. I'll take my chances with the river," she said quietly. "It feels more honest than the charity of men who have already decided the outcome." She adjusted the rope on the handcart. She took hold of the handles. She pushed the cart past him and onto the path that led north toward the sound of the falls that had been growing in her mind since the night Greta had unfolded those plans on the kitchen table. His last words followed her up the path, formal and definitive, as a closing statement. So be it. She did not look back. She kept her eyes on the path ahead, on the narrow track through the new green forest that climbed steadily toward the sound of the water. The cartwheels found the ruts and the stones, and she managed them without breaking stride, without adjusting her pace, without looking back once. The sound of Havenwood faded behind her, hammer sounds and the animal sounds, and the low murmur of a community continuing its business, indifferent now that the irregularity had been resolved. Ahead, the sound of the falls grew. She could feel it before she could hear it distinctly, a vibration in the ground and the air in her chest. The trees thinned as she climbed, giving way to rock and scrub brush and the increasing mist that told her she was getting close. When she reached the last bend in the path before the falls came into view, she stopped. She set down the cart handles and stood still for a moment, breathing the cold, wet air, looking up at the granite walls of the canyon rising on either side. And there on the eastern face, just at the waterline, where the oldest floods had reached and retreated and left their record in the rock, she saw the marks. Horizontal lines in the stone, dark with mineral deposit running in a series up the canyon, faced like the rings of a tree. Each one the record of water. Each one the testimony of a storm that the people below in their comfortable valley settlement had never thought to consult. The highest mark was 31 feet above where she was standing. She looked at it for a long time. Greta had measured it. Greta had written the number down 43 years ago in ink on leather and kept it in a coat pocket for the right moment, for the right person. The alcove behind the falls sat above that line. She picked up the cart handles and walked forward into the mist, into the growing roar, into the cool white thunder of the water. The spray hit her face and soaked through the front of her coat almost immediately, and the cold of it was sharp and clean and entirely without ceremony. She walked through the curtain of the falls. The sound closed around her like a door shutting. The world behind her, the document on the kitchen table, the three men with their folded hands in their decided expressions, the 7 days and the land taken, in the town that had measured her and found her insufficient, all of it became instantly inaudible behind the roar of the water. She stood at the entrance to the alcove and looked at the space before her. The granite walls curved away in both directions, sweeping in a great crescent that matched Greta's plans exactly. The ceiling soared into shadow far above. The floor was uneven, wet, covered in a thin slick of moss and river clay that would need to come out before anything else. The air was cold and saturated with mist and filled with the deep, resonant thunder of the falls, a sound not just heard but felt in the bones, in the back teeth, and the sternum. It was, by any conventional assessment, an entirely inhospitable place. She stood in it for a long moment, getting its measure, letting it become real, letting the plans in her mind begin to layer themselves over the actual stone and space and slope and shadow of the place she was going to call home. Then she set down the cart, unwrapped the surveying line she had added to her kit, and began to work. The first thing she did was not what most people would have done. Most people confronted with a cold, wet, echoing cave behind a waterfall would have thought about shelter, about walls, about something overhead to keep the mist off. The instinct toward enclosure is deep in human nature, the impulse to make a roof and call it home. Evelyn Vance did not think about the roof. She thought about the water. She spent the first full day in the alcove doing nothing but watching. She moved through the space slowly, methodically, following the paths that water was already taking across the floor, where it gathered, where it ran, where it seeped from the granite walls in thin, persistent sheets that caught the diffuse light and turned it silver. She crouched at different points and set Greta's small brass spirit level on the stone and read the bubble. She walked the perimeter twice, pressing her palm flat against the rock face at intervals, feeling for the cold wet of active seepage versus the drier, merely damp surface of stone that breathed but did not weep. She was mapping a system, not the system she intended to build, but the system that already existed, the one carved by water over centuries of patient, indifferent insistence. Before she could guide it, she had to understand it. Before she could build anything dry, she had to know exactly where dry was not. Greta had told her, do not block the water. Guide it. By the end of that first day, she had the essential picture. The primary seepage came from 2 points on the left wall and 1 point on the back wall, roughly centered. The floor drained naturally toward the front and slightly right, which meant the highest and driest ground was the rear left quadrant, a space roughly 12 feet wide and 16 feet deep, measured from the back wall. It was not the center of the alcove. It was not the most dramatic position, but it was the right one, and Evelyn had learned from Thomas and from Greta before him that the right position and the comfortable position were rarely the same thing. She built a fire that first night in the open alcove, sheltered from the fall's draft by the curve of the back wall, and ate salt pork and cold beans and thought about drainage channels. The sound of the falls at night was something she had not been fully prepared for. During the day while working, it receded into background, her mind occupied with task and measurement in the specific physical demands of the work. But at night, lying on her blankets on the stone floor with the fire burning low, it was enormous. It was not like other sounds. It did not come from a direction. It came from everywhere, from the stone itself, a vibration that moved through the rock beneath her and up through her blankets and into her spine. It was the sound of something that did not stop, that had never stopped, that would not stop. She lay there in the dark and listened to it, and she thought, this is the sound of something that does not care whether you are here or not. And she found to her mild surprise that this was not frightening. It was in fact the most honest thing she had heard in months. The water did not have an opinion about her. The water was not measuring her usefulness or tallying her liabilities. The water simply was, endlessly and without judgment, and the only question it posed was a practical one. Can you manage me, or will you let me manage you? She had been answering that question for 3 years before she ever arrived at the falls. The drainage work took 3 weeks. She began on May 8th, the first full day of real labor, and she did not stop until the channel system was complete. The work was done with a spade and a mattock in the spirit level in her own hands, and it was the hardest physical labor of her life, harder than the months of helping Thomas work the timber claim, harder than the winter they'd spent cutting firewood for the whole of the Eastern Road when the logging season ran short. The ground in the alcove was a dense composite of clay and riverstone and occasional granite intrusions, and it resisted the spade with a sullen persistence that turned every foot of progress into a negotiation. She began at the back wall, cutting the primary channel 6 inches wide, 8 inches deep along the curve of the wall from left to right, establishing the main artery of her drainage system. From this, she cut secondary channels radiating outward and downward toward the front of the alcove, following the natural slope of the floor, working with the existing geometry rather than against it. The spirit level was her constant companion. She checked her gradient every 2 feet, adjusting the depth of her cut to maintain the 1 degree downward slope Greta had specified. 1 degree. It seemed like almost nothing. But 1 degree applied consistently over 40 feet of channel produced a reliable and continuous movement of water, not a rush, not a trickle, but a steady, purposeful flow that would carry the seep and the mist and the minor flooding of heavy rainfall harmlessly away from her building site and back toward the edge of the alcove where it belonged. It was precise work. The precision was everything. A channel that ran slightly uphill in one section would pool and stagnate. A channel cut too shallow would overflow in heavy seepage conditions. A channel cut too wide would undermine the stability of the ground beside it. She made mistakes in the first section and corrected them before moving forward because she understood that a mistake in the drainage would propagate forward through every subsequent stage of construction, growing larger and more expensive with each phase until it produced a failure that could not be corrected at all. By the time the drainage system was complete, her hands had changed. The softness was entirely gone. The skin across her palms and fingers had thickened into something tough and slightly ridged, and there was a permanent darkness in the creases of her knuckles that the cold water in the creek would not entirely remove. She looked at her hands one evening in the firelight, turning them over, and thought of Greta's hands, the same quality, the evidence of the same kind of work done over years rather than weeks. She thought, I am becoming someone different, and she was not sure if that was loss or arrival. The foundation took the better part of a month. She quarried the stones from the creek bed downstream, flat, water-smoothed granite pieces that had been shaped by the creek over decades into the broad, even surfaces she needed. The work of quarrying them was simple and brutal, wading into the cold current, finding the right stones, lifting them from the creek bed, and carrying them back to the bank. Some of them weighed 50 pounds. Some weighed more. She learned quickly to judge weight by visual inspection alone, the particular density of granite expressing itself in the way a stone sat in the water, how much of it was visible above the surface, the relationship between its apparent size and its actual mass. She made multiple trips every day. She built a carrying rig from her hemp rope that distributed the weight across both shoulders rather than straining the muscles of one arm, and she adjusted the rig over the first week as she learned how her body responded to the load. The cold of the creek was constant and profound, numbing her legs to the knee within minutes of wading in, and she managed this by working in intervals 30 minutes in the water, 20 minutes by the fire, drying out 30 minutes back in the water. The discipline of the interval was important. She had read enough about cold water exposure to understand the difference between managed discomfort and genuine danger. When she had assembled enough stone, she began laying the floor. She started at the center of her chosen building site, that rear left quadrant 12 by 16 feet, the highest and driest ground in the alcove. She selected the largest and flattest stones for the base layer, fitting them together with the slow, intuitive puzzle working of someone accustomed to dealing with things that had no perfect solutions, only better and worse approximations. She mixed her mortar from the sand she collected at the creek's bend and the clay she dug from a deposit she had found higher up the cliff face, a vein of dense, fine-grained clay that proved to be an almost ideal bonding agent when mixed with sand in the right proportion, which she worked out through experiment over 3 days of failures and adjustments. Each stone was set and mortared and checked with the spirit level and adjusted if necessary, and then left to cure before she moved to the next. The process was slow enough to be maddening, and she did not allow herself to be maddened by it because she understood that the floor was the foundation of everything else, and a floor that was not perfectly level and solid would express its flaws upward through every wall and joint and beam she placed on top of it. When it was done, when she stood on the completed stone platform and felt no movement, no flex, no uncertainty beneath her feet, the platform was raised 12 inches above the surrounding alcove floor. A flat, solid, perfectly level island in the damp and uneven terrain of the cave. It was 12 feet wide and 16 feet deep, and she understood, the most important thing she had ever built. She allowed herself one evening of looking at it, just looking, sitting on the edge with her feet hanging over and watching the firelight move across the surface of the stone and feeling for a moment the particular satisfaction of a thing that had been imagined and then made real through nothing but sustained effort and correct thinking. Then she got up and went to sleep because the timber work started in the morning. The cedar grove was on the plateau above the falls, a quarter-mile back from the canyon edge through dense mixed forest. She had identified it on her third day in the area during one of her foraging expeditions, and she had known immediately that cedar was right. Thomas had taught her the properties of different woods over 3 years of living beside a working timber claim, their relative strength and flexibility, their resistance to rot and insects, the way different species responded to different working methods. Cedar was not the strongest wood in the forest. It was not the hardest or the heaviest. But in a permanently damp environment, cedar was the only choice. Its natural oils resisted moisture and fungal decay with a reliability that other woods could not match. A cedar structure that was properly built and sealed would outlast oak in these conditions by decades. And in the constant mist of the alcove, outlasting was everything. She felled 10 mature cedars over the course of a week. The felling axe Barnett had sold her was excellent. She had assessed this the moment she lifted it, feeling the balance, the slight forward weight of the head that made the downswing more efficient. And she worked with it the way Thomas had taught her to work with an axe. No wasted motion, consistent angle of attack, paying attention to the wood's response at each strike because the wood would tell you what it needed if you were quiet enough to listen. Each tree was a problem in physics before it was a problem in carpentry. She studied the lean, the roots, spread the weight distribution of the canopy, and she placed her wedges accordingly, cutting toward the fall line she had chosen and opening the hinge with precision. Not one of the 10 trees fell wrong. Not one damaged another in its fall or bound up in the canopy in a way that required dangerous intervention to correct. She thought of Thomas each time a tree went down. The sound of it, the long cracking groan of the hinge giving way, the gathering momentum, the tremendous final impact that shook the ground and sent birds exploding from the canopy for 100 yards in every direction. He had loved that sound. He had said it was the most honest sound in the world, something committing entirely to its direction and following through. She thought, yes, that is exactly right. The real work was the milling. She could not haul whole logs down to the alcove. The weight and the terrain made it impossible, and the rope work required to lower them safely down the cliff face would have been unmanageable with whole trunks. So she bucked each fallen tree into sections on the plateau, 12-foot and 16-foot lengths, the dimensions of her building plan, and then hewed each section flat on two sides using the broad axe she had ground to a precise edge the evening before the work began. This was the labor that changed her most. Not the hardest work, perhaps the drainage channels had been harder, in some ways harder, on the back and the hands. But the hewing was relentless in a way that required a different quality of endurance. Each beam took hours. She was working against the grain of the wood in some sections, finding the balance between efficiency and accuracy, keeping the faces flat and the dimensions consistent, so that her joints, when she cut them, would be cutting to actual measured surfaces and not to surfaces that merely approximated her plans. Her hands blistered. The blisters hardened. The calluses thickened over the calluses already built by the drainage work. Her shoulders, which had ached through the first week of the stone quarrying, stopped aching and simply became the kind of shoulders that could do what was needed without complaint. 2 weeks of milling produced the timber she needed. 37 beams of varying length, each one hewed flat on two faces stacked in order of their intended position in the structure, covered with a length of canvas she had brought for exactly this purpose, to keep the rain off while she worked out the rigging for lowering them. The lowering was the most technically demanding operation of the entire project. The cliff face below the plateau was not sheer. It angled, broke into ledges, offered occasional anchor points, but it was 50 feet of broken rock above the alcove entrance, and the beams she needed to lower weighed between 80 and 140 pounds each. A dropped beam would not just be a lost beam. It could break on impact or bounce unpredictably, or strike the structure she was already building with enough force to destroy weeks of work. She spent a full day before the first lowering working out the rigging. She anchored her 200-foot hemp rope to a massive old-growth fir at the plateau edge, testing the anchor with her full weight, plus the weight of the heaviest stone she could find, and worked out a friction system using a second shorter rope wrapped around a cedar stump that allowed her to control the descent speed with her body weight rather than her hand strength alone. She lowered one small test piece first, watched it descend, made 3 adjustments to the friction wrap, lowered another, made one more adjustment. Then she began the actual work. Each beam took between 3 and 4 hours to lower safely. She guided each one from above, managing the friction wrap with total attention, reading the rope's tension and the beam's movement through the entire length of her own hands. When a beam reached the alcove entrance, she had rigged a simple guide system, using the remaining rope to walk it sideways into position. She could not be in 2 places at once, above managing the descent and below managing the landing. So she thought through the problem carefully and built a solution that did not require her to be. 22 beams, 22 descents, 11 days of work. By the end, the rope had worn grooves into the bark of the anchor fir, and her hands, despite the wrapping she had improvised from strips of canvas, were crossed with rope burns that she treated each evening with pine pitch and kept wrapped through the night. She did not think of the rope burns as injury. She thought of them as information. The rope was telling her something about friction and load and the limits of improvised systems, and she intended to remember every word. The cabin rose over the following 3 weeks. She had designed it as an A-frame. The steep triangle of its profile she had calculated would do three things simultaneously. It would shed the moisture blown in from the falls more effectively than any other roof geometry. It would require fewer complex joints than a conventional rectangular structure, reducing the number of potential failure points. And its inherent triangular rigidity meant that the structure would resist racking forces, the lateral pressure, of the fall's constant draft without requiring the kind of diagonal bracing that would have been difficult to execute in the alcove's constrained space. She cut her joints by hand. Mortise and tenon, each one measured twice, and cut once, the chisel work done in the early mornings when her hands were steadiest, and the light from the fire supplemented by two tallow candles she had brought for precision work was most even. The joints took time, more time than she had planned for, because the cedar, while relatively soft, required care at the chisel to avoid splitting along the grain at the tenon shoulders. She ruined two joints in the first week and recut the affected beam sections, adjusting her technique before proceeding. When the joints were cut, she raised the A-frames. This was the work that most required ingenuity in the absence of a second pair of hands. Every problem in construction is easier with two people, and the raising of structural frames is among the problems that seem almost specifically designed to require them. She solved it with a system of temporary props and rope guides, walking each frame up from horizontal to vertical, incrementally securing it at each stage before proceeding to the next, never allowing a frame to be in a position where a single failure would bring it down. 4 frames, 4 raising zones. It took 4 days. When the frames were vertical and braced temporarily against each other, she addressed what she had identified from the beginning as the most critical structural element, the connection to the rock. The fall's draft was not constant. It shifted direction with subtle unpredictability, sometimes pushing from directly ahead, sometimes angling from the left or right as pressure differentials moved through the alcove's curved space. A structure anchored only to its own foundation would eventually walk small, lateral movements, accumulating over months and years until the joints loosened and the whole thing came apart by degrees. She needed to fuse the structure to the mountain. The iron pythons Barnett had sold her, 20 of them 3-inch points, his best work, the iron consistency of a man who took genuine pride in his craft, even when he didn't think much of his customer, were the mechanism. She drove them into the fissures at the base of the canyon wall, using the heaviest hammer she had, working each one in with the patient incremental technique Thomas had taught her for driving stakes into hard ground, short strokes to set the point, then longer strokes once the direction was established, reading the ring of the steel against the stone to know when the piton had found solid purchase and when it was running along a surface crack that would eventually let it go. 5 pitons she pulled and reset. 15 held on the first drive. She lashed the base of each A-frame to its 2 anchor pitons using her hemp rope in a wrapping pattern that distributed load across multiple contact points rather than concentrating it at one, a technique from an old rigging book she had found in Thomas's collection and read twice before the building began. The completed connection was immovable. She tested it with everything she had, full body weight applied laterally at the peak of each frame, the rope ends pulled against their anchors with both hands at once, and nothing gave. The structure was part of the mountain now. She split cedar shakes for the walls and roof over the following week using a froe and mallet to cleave the sections along the grain, a method that produced a natural taper in each shake, thin at one edge and thick at the other, ideal for the overlapping installation that would shed water the way a fish's scales shed water each layer, protecting the one below it and directing moisture outward and down. The installation was slow work. Each shake had to be positioned with the taper running the right direction, overlapping the previous course by a specific amount. She had calculated this overlap to ensure no water could drive upward beneath the surface, even in the lateral wind of the fall's draft. She nailed each shake with 2 nails from Pruitt's kegs, setting them at a specific angle to resist pull-through. She worked from the bottom up on each face the way shingling had to be done, starting at the lowest point and progressing upward so that each new course covered the nail heads of the course below. The finished surface, when she stepped back to look at it, was tight. Not the seamless, planked exterior of a conventional cabin, but the overlapping, slightly textured surface of a structure built to manage water rather than simply resist it. It moved moisture, directed it in the same way her drainage channels move moisture, actively, intelligently, not with brute impermeability, but with a system designed to work with what the environment offered. The sealing was the final step, and it was Greta's recipe unchanged. She collected pine resin from the trees on the plateau over 3 days, working in the early mornings when the temperature was low enough to make the resin flow slowly and be scraped cleanly from the bark incisions she made. The collection was sticky and fragrant and required concentration too deep. An incision would damage the cambium and kill the tree. Too shallow would not produce useful flow. She came back from each session with her hands amber-colored and sweet-smelling, the resin clinging to the grooves of her fingerprints in ways that took hours of careful cleaning to remove. She heated the collected resin in Thomas's cast iron pot over a sustained fire, melting it down and mixing in the fine clay she had saved from the foundation work and the charcoal powder she had ground from fully burned hardwood. The proportions were Greta's 1 part clay to 4 parts resin charcoal added to thickness, and she followed them exactly, testing the resulting pitch on a small surface and watching how it flowed and hardened before committing it to the actual structure. The pitch went on hot, applied with a wide brush she had made from bundled cedar bark. She worked every seam, every joint, every nail, had every point where two surfaces met and might allow moisture to enter. The work took 4 days. The pitch darkened as it cured, going from the amber brown of fresh application to a deep flat black. And the smell of it, pine and char, and something ancient and chemical filled the alcove and drifted out through the falls in thin threads of scented vapor. When it was done, she stood inside the completed cabin and pressed her palm flat against the interior wall and felt dry. In the middle of a waterfall, dry. The hearth was the last element, and it required the longest thinking before any physical work began. A fireplace inside a wooden structure is a controlled experiment in managed disaster. In a permanently damp cave with the constant air movement of a major waterfall, the variables multiplied considerably. She needed a hearth that would not smoke back into the cabin, that would draw consistently despite the draft variations of the falls, that would not create a fire risk against the cedar walls, and that would produce sufficient heat to keep 2 people alive through a mountain winter. She spent 3 days just sitting with the problem, looking at the back wall of the alcove, before she saw what Greta's plans had indicated was there: the fissure. It was a vertical crack in the granite face, perhaps 6 inches wide at its narrowest point, and running upward from head height into the shadowed upper reaches of the alcove ceiling, and she was increasingly convinced out through the cliff top entirely. She tested it on a calm evening with a small fire built directly beneath it, watching the smoke. The smoke moved upward into the fissure and did not return. A natural flue, a crack in the mountain that led to the sky. She built the hearth and chimney from riverstone and clay mortar, constructing them against the back wall with the mass of the granite escarpment, as abutting that mass of solid rock would absorb heat from the fire and radiate it back into the cabin for hours after the fire had burned to coals. She channeled the stone chimney carefully to interface with the natural fissure, fitting cut stone to the irregular edges of the crack with patient, deliberate work, creating a sealed connection that would not allow smoke to bypass the fissure and enter the cabin. She lit the first test fire on a gray afternoon in early August, 3 months and 1 week after she had first walked through the falls. The smoke rose. It entered the chimney. It traveled up through the stone channel and into the fissure and disappeared into the mountain and was gone. The draw was perfect. Heat began to build in the small space within minutes, a dry, steady, radiating warmth that moved from the hearthstone out through the floor and gradually through the air until the interior of the cabin was for the first time genuinely warm. Not relatively warm, not warmer than the cold outside. Warm. The kind of warmth that meant survival through a mountain winter. She sat on the stone floor with her back against the wall and her knees pulled up and looked at the fire and let herself be still for a while. She was very tired. Not the acute exhaustion of a single hard day, but the deep, settled tiredness of 3 months of sustained maximum effort, the kind that lives in the bones and the connective tissue and will not be addressed by a single night's sleep, but requires weeks of ordinary days to fully release. She was also not finished. The winter preparations, food storage, firewood, the dozen other tasks that would determine whether she survived the cold months lay entirely ahead of her. The structure was built, not the life that had to be lived in it, But for this one evening, she let herself sit by the first fire in her home and listen to the falls and think about what she had done. The entire material cost of the cabin, Barnett's pitons and Axe Pruitt's supplies, the additional small items she had purchased came to $27. The remaining $20 in the leather pouch was tucked inside her coat, a reserve she had not touched. $27 in 3 months of work. She looked at the fire. She looked at the walls that did not leak. She listened to the falls that had been her constant companion for 12 weeks now, whose voice she had learned to read the way Greta had said she would not, as noise but as language. The changing pitch and volume telling her things about rainfall in the high mountains, about snowmelt, rates, about the mood of the watershed above her. The falls were speaking in their ordinary register tonight, the sound of a system in balance processing a normal late summer water load, the sound of equilibrium. But she had been watching the signs for weeks, the squirrels working with a frantic intensity she had not seen in previous autumns, the geese moving south earlier than the pattern she had observed in 3 years of watching from the valley. The color of the water in the creek, not the clear runoff of ordinary rain, but an increasingly silty quality, the color of water that had traveled far and fast over disturbed ground. And then there were the marks on the canyon wall. She had studied them in detail during the foundation work, pressing her face close to the stone on calm days, tracing the lines with her fingertips. The highest mark, the one Greta had measured at 31 feet above the alcove floor, had a quality different from the lower flood lines. It was older, deeper into the stone, stained with minerals that took centuries to accumulate in that concentration. Whatever had produced that mark had not been an ordinary flood. It had been an event of a different order entirely. And the mountains above the valley, she understood from everything she had been watching, were holding more water than they had in living memory. She did not know when. She could not know the precise trigger or the exact magnitude. But she understood the direction everything was moving, the way you understand a weight that has been lifted to its tipping point, not if, but when. She banked the fire for the night, wrapped herself in both woolen blankets, and lay down on the stone floor of her home. Outside, the falls roared on in the dark, speaking their continuous language to anyone who had learned to listen. She had learned. And somewhere below her, in the comfortable lamp-lit houses of Havenwood, the people who had measured her and found her insufficient were sleeping the deep sleep of people who have never had reason to question the ground beneath them. The rain began on the evening of October 12th, not the storm, not yet. The storm was still 2 days away, gathering itself in the Pacific with the slow, terrible patience of something that did not need to hurry because it was going to arrive regardless. What came on the 12th was the harbinger, a steady, heavy downpour that was different from ordinary autumn rain, in the way that a warning is different from the thing it warns about. Purposeful, insistent, the rain of a sky that had made up its mind. Evelyn was already in town when it started. She had come down that morning to check on Greta moving through the forest trail with the easy efficiency of someone who had made this walk a dozen times in the weeks since the cabin was finished. She brought dried venison and a small bag of yarrow she had harvested from the high meadow, and she carried in the back of her mind the specific measurements she had been tracking for 3 weeks. The water level marks she made each morning on a stake driven into the creek bank just below the falls. The incremental rise that had accelerated sharply in the last 10 days from a 1/4 inch per day to nearly 2 inches. Greta's cottage was at the edge of town, small and tidy, with the particular quality of a space inhabited by someone who had long ago stripped away everything unnecessary. Evelyn found her at the table with her tea, looking out the window at the creek with the concentrated attention of someone reading a text. "You've seen the color of it?" Evelyn said, setting down her pack. "Since Tuesday," Greta said. She did not turn from the window. "It's carrying clay from above the second ridge. That means the ground up there is past holding." The cinder creek outside the window was not the clear, cold stream of ordinary October. It was thick and brown, moving with a heaviness that spoke of everything it was carrying, not just water, but the saturated earth of a watershed that had reached its limit and was beginning to let go. Along its banks, the water was already lapping at the lower roots of the cottonwood trees, depositing small dark lines of silt at each recession that marked how far it had come in the last 12 hours. Evelyn looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at her grandmother. "Come with me," she said. "Today. Now." Greta was quiet for a moment. She turned from the window and looked at her granddaughter with the same quality of attention she had always used, that concentrated, pressure-like focus that seemed to go past the surface of things. "The path is difficult," she said. "I know the path. I'll manage the difficult parts." "The sound of the falls frightens my old bones." "The sound of the falls is just water doing what water does," Evelyn said. "It's the silence after a levee breaks that you should be frightened of." Something moved in Greta's expression, not fear but recognition, the acknowledgement of a truth she had known longer than Evelyn had been alive. "Let me pack a bag," she said. They were 20 minutes from Greta's door when the trouble found them. Evelyn had seen Barnett watching from the smithy doorway as they moved through the eastern side of town. His arms crossed his expression, carrying that particular quality of settled judgment she had come to recognize in all three of the councilmen, the reflexive measuring of situations for their implications. She had noted him and kept walking. But Barnett had reported their movement to someone before the door of the smithy had closed behind her. Elder Holt and Deacon Pruitt were on the path at the northern edge of town, standing in it specifically, not beside it, not crossing it, but positioned with the deliberate centrality of a roadblock. Holt in his good coat, Pruitt beside him with his hands clasped and his expression arranged in its professional configuration of regretful necessity. Evelyn stopped the handcart she had borrowed from Greta's shed. Greta stood at her shoulder, small and straight, her traveling bag held in both hands. "What is the meaning of this?" Holt said, his gaze moving between them and settling on Greta's bag with an expression that made his interpretation of the situation entirely clear. "Are you removing your grandmother from her home without her consent?" "I am accompanying my granddaughter at my own request," Greta said before Evelyn could speak. Her voice was dry and absolute, the voice of a woman who had outlasted a great many men's certainties. "I am not aware that this requires your authorization, Elder." Holt's jaw tightened slightly. He redirected to Evelyn. "You are spreading fear through this community," he said. "Your presence here today, your obvious preparations, people have been watching. They are unsettled." "The water level at the base of the falls has risen 19 inches in 10 days, Evelyn said. "The creek is carrying clay from above the second ridge. The geese left 5 weeks early. These are observations, not opinions." "The levees are holding," Pruitt said. His voice had a slightly elevated quality, a half note of pitch that she recognized as the sound of a man asserting something he needs to believe rather than something he does believe. "They have held for 50 years. The engineering is sound." "The engineering is excellent," Evelyn said, and she meant it entirely, "for the floods they were designed for." A silence fell over the path. Pruitt glanced at Holt, then back at Evelyn. Then he took a single step forward, separating himself from Holt by a foot. He lowered his voice to the register of a private conversation, though Holt was standing close enough to hear every word. "I need to ask you something directly," he said. His eyes were steady on her face, and in them she saw the thing she had recognized on the day she bought her supplies, that involuntary flash of calculation of a man running numbers he didn't want anyone else to see. "How certain are you?" She looked at him without expression. "Certain enough to take my grandmother to high ground," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved through his expression, the compressed geography of a man whose self-interest and his fear were fighting for control of his face. He glanced again at Holt, then back at her. "If I were to quietly, you understand, discreetly, move certain inventory to the upper storeroom." He stopped. He pressed his lips together. "What you know? How you know it? Is there a way to—" He stopped again, unable to finish the sentence he had started. She understood precisely what he was asking. Not how to warn the town, not how to protect his neighbors or the families on the northern road, whose houses sat 30 feet below the flood marks she had read in the canyon stone. He was asking how to protect his inventory while maintaining the public appearance of sharing the general confidence that the levees would hold. How to be right in private while being seen to be calm. How to profit from her knowledge without paying the cost of honesty. She looked at him for a long moment. "Move your inventory, Deacon," she said quietly. "Move it to the highest point you have access to, and then tell your neighbors why." She held his gaze for one more second. Then she picked up the handles of the handcart and guided it past both men without another word. Greta walked beside her, her bag in both hands, her eyes forward. Behind them, Holt's voice carried the final verdict with all the gravity of a man pronouncing from a position he could not yet see was already undermined. "If you speak another word of this panic in my town," He called after her. You will not return to this valley. Do you understand me? Evelyn did not answer. She guided her grandmother north along the muddy path toward the sound of the water and the high, safe stone of the mountain, and she did not look back once. The storm that broke on the evening of October 14th was not a storm. The word was insufficient. A storm was a weather event with a duration and a resolution, a thing that arrived and did its damage and moved on and left a world that could be assessed and repaired. What broke over the Cinder Creek Valley on the night of the 14th was a sustained meteorological assault, a column of tropical moisture that had traveled thousands of miles from warm Pacific waters and collided with the cold mountain air of the Oregon interior with the force of two systems that had no business meeting and no ability to avoid it. The rain did not fall. It was delivered, horizontal and driven, hammering the world with a consistency that removed the concept of interval. There was no between the drops, no surface that was not immediately and continuously saturated. Within the first 2 hours, every stream in the watershed above Havenwood was running at 3 times its normal volume. Within 4 hours, the tributaries had doubled again. Inside the cabin behind Vail Falls, the sound was extraordinary. The falls themselves had been building since the rain began, the watershed above responding to the deluge with the speed of ground that was already saturated, the water running off immediately rather than being absorbed, reaching the creek within minutes of falling and pushing its volume forward with cumulative accelerating force. By midnight, the falls had changed from their familiar thunder to something that had no previous comparison in Evelyn's experience. The curtain of water was no longer a curtain. It was a wall, opaque brown, carrying logs and debris and the stripped remains of whatever the creek had torn from its banks in the hours of rising. The impact where it struck the riverbed below was felt in the granite beneath the cabin floor. Not just heard, felt. A continuous shuddering that moved through the stone and up through the carefully laid foundation and into the soles of their feet as they stood on it. Greta sat close to the fire, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of yarrow tea, and she was entirely calm. Not the forced calm of someone managing fear, but the genuine calm of a person who has spent 70 years coming to terms with the fact that some things are larger than human beings and has made her peace with that particular truth. Tell me about the channels, she said. Evelyn was at the small, thick glass window she had salvaged from a collapsed shed on the plateau, set it herself in a frame she had built into the front wall, mortared in place, the only view to the outside. She could see almost nothing through it. The world beyond was the brown, opaque wall of the falls in flood. Running at capacity, she said, the back wall seep is higher than I've seen it. The primary channel is moving it, and the foundation dry. She pressed her palm to the floor without looking down. Completely dry. Greta nodded slowly as though this was the answer she had calculated 43 years ago and was now simply confirming against the actual event. The pitch seems, not a drop. They sat together through the long hours of the night, the two of them in the firelit interior of the cabin that should not have been possible, while outside the world unmade itself with complete indifference to their presence. Evelyn fed the fire at regular intervals, keeping the heat steady, and she listened to the falls and read in their voice the story of what the watershed above was doing. The volume increasing in surges as new tributaries reached their overflow points and added their weight to the creek, each surge announcing itself in the escalating pitch of the falls before arriving as a fresh wall of brown water. At some point past midnight, Greta slept upright in her chair, the way old people sleep, her breathing slow, and even her hands still wrapped loosely around the cup. Evelyn sat alone with the fire and the sound in her own thoughts. She thought about 31 people. She did not know yet that it would be 31. She did not know the number, but she understood with the same precise clarity with which she understood the water level marks on her creek stake that the levee was not going to hold through this. She had seen its construction. She had measured the canyon walls. She knew what the highest marks meant, and she knew that the storm currently dismantling the watershed above Havenwood was the precise kind of event that had produced those marks. The event the levee's builders had not imagined because they had not read the stone. She thought about Holt's hands on the council table, about Pruitt and his silver watch chain, about Barnett with his arms crossed and his gaze fixed somewhere above her head. She thought about the women who had come with food she didn't need, about the woman who had come alone and leaned close and whispered about October, about a ride out to a timber claim, about timing that could not be proven and could not be ignored. She thought about the children. Around 3 in the morning, the pitch of the falls changed in a way she had not heard before. Not louder, it was past loud in any meaningful sense, past the threshold where volume registers as a distinct quality. What changed was its register. A lower frequency added beneath the primary roar, a subsonic component she felt more in her chest cavity than heard with her ears. She went to the window and pressed her face close to the glass and could see nothing through the solid brown opacity of the flood. But she felt it in the stone beneath her feet. A new vibration, a different frequency, the particular resonance of a large structure failing catastrophically somewhere downstream. She understood what it was. She went to her pack and began to prepare. At 3:17 in the morning of October 15th, the northern levee failed. It did not fail gradually. It did not develop a slow seep that might have given warning a trickle that widened over hours into something that could be addressed with sandbags and collective labor and the organized response of a community that had time to react. The levee that Elder Holt's grandfather had built with genuine skill and genuine pride failed the way things fail, when they have been built to the absolute limit of one understanding and then subjected to something entirely outside that understanding. It disintegrated. The creek running at a volume the levee's engineers had not imagined, because they had not read the canyon walls, had been pressing against the northern face for 6 hours, with a force that increased every 40 minutes as new tributaries reached their overflow points. The levee's core-dense packed earth that had served well for 50 years of ordinary pressure reached its saturation point in the 4th hour. In the 5th hour, internal erosion began. Water found microscopic paths through the saturated earth, each path widening the one beside it, the process invisible from the outside and unstoppable from within until it was too late to be outside. When the face gave way, it gave all at once. 10 feet of water brown, carrying the accumulated wreckage of everything the upper valley had released into the creek in the previous 8 hours, moved through the gap with a force that the remaining levee sections could not redirect or absorb. It found the path of least resistance directly through the center of Havenwood, and it took that path with the complete indifference of water for everything that human beings have placed in its way. The houses on the northern road went first, not flooded, removed. The foundations set in the valley floor at exactly the depth and position that had seemed permanent and adequate for 50 years offered no meaningful resistance to a wall of water, moving at that speed carrying that mass. The houses broke apart and their components joined the flood, becoming part of the force that struck the next row of buildings and the next, each addition to the torrent, increasing the weight and velocity of what followed. The church bell began to toll as the water entered the church, not wrung by human hands, but moved by the current that swirled through the open belfry, producing a random arrhythmic clanging that was the most surreal element in a night that had exhausted surrealism entirely. People woke to that bell and to the roar that was already inside their walls, already below their floors, already making the decisions about what would stand and what would not. Some of them made it to rooftops. Some made it to the high ground of the eastern ridge. 31 of them did not make it anywhere. Dawn on October 15th came gray and specific. The rain had eased from its overnight intensity to a steady drizzle that felt almost gentle in comparison, the sky having expended its most violent intention and settling now into persistence. The light when it arrived was the flat, diffuse light of heavy overcast, illuminating without warmth or shadow, a landscape that was not the Cinder Creek Valley anymore and would never precisely be again. The valley was a lake, brown and slow-moving, dotted with the debris of everything that had been lower and interrupted by the tops of the tallest structures, the church steeple, the upper stories of the mill, the peaked roof of the meeting hall, rising from the brown water like the last evidence of a world that had been. Evelyn had the coracle in the water by the time the light was sufficient to navigate by. She had built it 6 weeks earlier, during the period of late September, when the rain had been heavy enough to make the plateau work inadvisable, and she had needed an indoor task. The design came from one of her grandmother's older stories, a tradition that went back further than either of them could trace, a simple bowl-shaped boat of wicker and hide that was lightweight, maneuverable, and almost impossible to capsize in the kind of moving water that would swamp a conventional craft. She had built the wicker frame from willow shoots collected from the creek bank and bent, while green over a form she made from the remaining cedar offcuts. The hide was deer from two animals she had taken in September, scraped and stretched, and treated with the same pine pitch she had used on the cabin seams. The result was a boat that weighed 19 pounds and held 4 inches of freeboard above the waterline with 2 adults aboard. It was not fast. It was not elegant. It moved through water with the slightly ungainly determination of something that understood its purpose precisely and had no interest in anything beyond it. She paddled out from the falls into the flooded valley with the paddle she had shaped from a cedar plank, reading the currents the way she had learned to read them in the creek over months of close observation, not fighting the water, but working with its movement using the eddies and the slow drift of the main current to carry her toward the structures she could see above the surface. The meeting hall was the highest visible roofline. She went there first. She navigated through the debris field with a focus so complete it left no room for anything else, not the cold, not the smell, not the sight of what else floated in that brown water. She used the paddle to fend off the larger pieces of wreckage, reading the current 2 boat lengths ahead at all times, finding the lines through the chaos, the way she had found the lines through the forest on the trail she had walked 100 times in the dark. She heard them before she saw them. Voices, the particular strained quality of voices that have been using everything available just to maintain coherence. She came around the far side of the meeting hall and found them on the roof, Elder Holt and his wife Pruitt, and his wife and daughter and 3 others she recognized from the Eastern Road. 7 of them clustered at the peak of the pitched roof, soaked through and gray with cold and shock, reduced by the night to their most essential selves. Holt saw her first. The expression on his face was not what she had expected, and she had thought about this moment in the small hours while the flood dismantled everything below her. She had thought she might see shame or the residual calculation of a man working out how to manage the narrative of what had happened. What she saw instead was something rawer and more permanent than either of those, something that had been stripped of all its protective architecture by a night of terror and loss and the complete irrevocable destruction of everything he had used to understand the world and his place in it. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he cannot explain and has stopped trying to explain. She brought the coracle alongside the roof edge. "I can take 2 at a time," she said. "Children first." Nobody argued. Nobody invoked procedure or authority. Pruitt lifted his daughter, a girl of perhaps 8 years, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's practical stillness, and handed her down into the coracle with hands shaking from cold and from something that was not cold. Evelyn settled the child in the bow, counterbalanced her own weight in the stern, and paddled back toward the alcove. She made 4 trips to the meeting hall. Between the second and third trips, crossing through the eastern side of the flooded town, where the water was shallower and the debris denser, she heard a sound that did not fit the general acoustic register of the disaster, a specific human sound from a half-submerged oak tree whose upper branches were still well clear of the waterline. She changed course without deliberation. Barnett was in the tree. He was not in it with dignity. He was clinging to the branch the way a person clings to things when the alternative to clinging is not a thing they can allow themselves to contemplate. His massive arms wrapped around the wood, his face pressed against the bark, with the complete concentration of a body that has given everything to one instruction and has nothing left for anything else. She brought the coracle alongside and spoke his name. He turned his head. His eyes found her. In them, she saw the same stripping away she had seen in Holt's face, but in Barnett's case, there was something additional that was specific to him and to this moment and to the particular geometry of where they both were. He was looking at her in the coracle she had built on the water she had understood and prepared for, and she could watch in his face the precise moment the full weight of it arrived. Not just that she had been right, not just that he had been wrong, the specific, unambiguous weight of it that he had sold her the pitons with contempt, and those pitons were currently set in the granite wall of the alcove holding the structure that was sheltering his wife and 3 other people he knew. That this 19-year-old woman he had filed under useless was the only reason he was going to see the winner. "Get in," she said. He got in. The coracle settled low with his weight, but maintained its freeboard. She paddled back toward the falls with short, efficient strokes, not thinking about anything except the water and the next trip and the people still out there waiting. On the 7th trip, she found a farmhouse roof near the southwestern edge of the floodplain with 2 small children on it, a boy and a girl neither older than 6 holding each other with the focused grip of children who have been told to hold on and are doing exactly and only that. Their parents were not on the roof. She did not let her eyes linger on the implications of their absence. She took the children aboard. The coracle sat very low with 3 people in it, and the return required more care than any previous trip, longer route avoiding the main current, entirely working the slow eddy behind the mill's upper structure to make progress without fighting the full weight of the water. On the 8th trip, the world tried to kill her. She was crossing the open water in the center of the floodplain, picking her way through a debris field of broken lumber and scattered fence posts when the log came from her left. A full cedar trunk stripped clean of its branches, moving with the main current at a speed she had no time to respond to. It struck the coracle's right side with a force that lifted the boat half out of the water and flipped it in a single instantaneous motion that allowed no intermediate position. The cold hit her like a physical blow. The kind of cold that reaches past sensation into something more fundamental, not pain, but the removal of choice, a command issued directly to the body below the level of conscious decision. Surface. Breathe, survive. She came up in the current, already moving fast downstream, the paddle gone, the coracle upside down 10 feet to her right and receding. She reached for it and missed. Reached again with everything she had and felt the wicker rim under her fingers and closed her hand around it. The current took her. She held the coracle and let the current take her both, because fighting the current directly was a method of drowning quickly, and she had things to do before she drowned. She felt the water carrying her south toward the lower end of the floodplain, where the valley narrowed and the current would eventually have to deal with her on more negotiable terms, and she counted the structures she was passing and maintained her orientation and waited for the current to offer her what she needed. A rooftop edge passed within arm's reach. She caught the eave with her free hand, checked her movement against the pull of the current, and worked her way hand over hand to the roof peak. Her left shoulder had been wrenched when the log struck. Not dislocated, she assessed with the quick, clinical attention of someone who does not have the option of being injured right now, but badly strained the joint, screaming at her with every movement of her left arm. She noted it. She set it aside. She flipped the coracle upright. She checked its integrity. The wicker frame had taken the impact, but held the hide seams intact, the pitch waterproofing uncompromised. She retrieved her spare paddle from where it was lashed to the interior frame, because she had tied it there before setting out that morning, because she had understood that a single paddle in flood conditions was an assumption she could not afford to make. She sat for 30 seconds with the paddle across her knees and breathed. Her hands were shaking. Not from weakness from the bone and from adrenaline, which produced the same shaking, but mean different things, and she knew the difference. She breathed through it and waited for it to subside to a level she could work with. Then she climbed back into the coracle and went back out. By mid-morning, 23 people were in the alcove. The space Evelyn had built for one that had sheltered 2 through the worst night of the storm now held a community of the broken and the surviving. They sat on the stone floor she had laid, wrapped in every blanket and extra garment she had accumulated through the months of preparation, clustered around the hearth, whose steady warmth had been engineered into the mountain itself. The smoke rose through its channel and the fissure and was gone into the sky above the cliff. The pitch-sealed walls held without compromise. The drainage channels ran silently in their courses, and the foundation beneath 23 sets of feet remained completely dry. Some of them were children who had been separated from parents who were not coming back. And these were the ones Evelyn watched most carefully and tended to most directly, because shock in children presents differently than it does in adults and requires a different quality of presence. She made tea. Yarrow and dried mint brewed in Thomas's cast iron pot in batches distributed in every cup and tin vessel she possessed. She fed the fire. She moved through the crowded space with the quiet efficiency of someone performing work she had been preparing for without knowing it, checking on people, adjusting blankets, doing the small constant tasks that kept a group of traumatized human beings on the functional side of the line between shock and collapse. She was working one-handed on the binding around her left shoulder, her teeth supplementing her right hand, her left arm largely useless when Barnett sat down beside her. She had not heard him approach. He moved quietly for a man of his size, and her attention was on the bandaging. She became aware of him when his shadow fell across her hands and the work she was trying to do. She looked up. He was looking at the wall behind her, at the iron pitons set in the granite face, the ones his hands had shaped at his anvil, now dark with their months of mineral deposit from the damp air, still absolutely immovable in their fissures. The hemp rope lashings that connected the A-frame bases to those anchors were within arm's reach of where they both sat. His face held nothing she had a name for. It was past the available vocabulary of ordinary human experience, past shame, past regret, past the language of a man processing information that challenges what he thought he knew. He was a man who had spent his working life sorting things into useful and useless, and he was now sitting inside the definitive and irrefutable evidence that his sorting had been entirely catastrophically wrong about the one thing that had ultimately mattered. He did not speak. He reached across without preamble or ceremony or any gesture toward the conversation that the moment might have been expected to require. And he took the end of the bandage she had been trying to manage with one hand and his teeth, and he began to wrap it. His hands, the same hands that had crossed over his chest in contempt on the day she walked into his forge, the same hands that had forged the pitons, now holding the wall that was holding all of them, worked with a care entirely inconsistent with their size. Gentle, precise. The care of a man who knows how to work with his hands and is applying that knowledge to something that matters to him. He wrapped the shoulder correctly. Pressure distributed across the joint. He tied the ends. He checked the tension with one finger. He made a small adjustment. Then he set his hands in his lap and looked at the wall. She looked at the side of his face for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, said nothing further. They sat together in the warmth of the hearth she had built inside the mountain, and the falls roared on outside. And neither of them needed the conversation that the rest of the room was eventually going to have. Elder Holt came to her in the late afternoon. He had been sitting in the back corner of the alcove since his arrival, and she had watched him from the periphery of her attention through the hours, the progressive collapse of his posture as the day went on, the way his certainty left him, the way heat leaves a stone after the fire dies. Gradually, then completely. Until what remained was just a man of 58 sitting on a stone floor that a 19-year-old woman had laid wrapped in a blanket she had woven into her preparations alive because of a boat she had built from a design older than any institution he had ever served. He stood before her now the way people stand when they have prepared something and found in the moment of standing that their preparation was entirely inadequate for what the moment actually required. He tried twice to begin. The first attempt produced no sound. The second produced the opening of a formal sentence that came apart before it found its verb. He stopped. He looked down at the floor. At the stone floor, flat and dry and precisely level beneath his feet, laid one stone at a time by the woman he had expelled. He looked at the walls, at the pitons, at the hearth in its steady heat, and the 23 people his decisions had placed in this room, and at the children sitting together against the far wall who would not see their parents again. "We were wrong," he said, "about everything." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 31 people, about the homes that were debris floating in the floodplain below them, about Thomas and a ride out to a timber claim in October, and hands that stayed perfectly still because they had no reason to be anxious about an outcome already secured. "Save it," she said quietly, "for the 31 who didn't make it." He received this the way it deserved to be received, without deflection, without the procedural language that had always been his refuge. He simply stood there and held it, and after a moment he nodded once and walked back to his corner and sat down with his grief, which was genuine and which she intended for him to carry for the rest of his life. She watched him go. She felt no satisfaction in it. She had imagined in the months of solitary work, when the nights were long and the falls were loud and the injustice was still fresh, that there might be satisfaction in a moment like this one. That vindication earned through 3 months of physical labor and years of being underestimated would arrive with some quality of triumph. What she felt instead was sorrow, the specific settled sorrow of being right about something you had hoped to be wrong about. 31 people, a town in ruins, children who would not see their parents again. She had not wanted the levee to fail. She had wanted to be wrong about the canyon walls. The waters of Cinder Creek receded over 3 days. They left behind a landscape that required a new vocabulary to describe accurately. The valley floor had been remade. The creek had cut a new channel wider